Welcome to High School Debate Bootcamp. The motion before the House today is this House would abolish death penalty. Now I would like to welcome the Prime Minister. Please deliver the speech within 5 minutes. Get here.
Imagine walking down to your death knowing you did nothing wrong. Your entire life, your hopes and dreams crushed because the system was not good enough or cared enough to figure out what happened. And imagine that in 20 years, your entire existence will be exonerated because of new technology. That is a status quo that we want to change in today's debate. There will be 2 points coming from proposition. Opening government. Firstly, on principle, and secondly, where the death penalty does nothing to deter crimes. But before that, I'd like to move on to my framework. We have one major point in framework. Instead of the death penalty, we'll provide life in prison. The difference between life and death is that you will get more chances to get released if you did not commit the crimes. Therefore, even if the opposition argues about retribution, the people that did commit crimes, they're still likely to suffer life in prison, which washes out this claim. So moving on to my principle. Now, the thesis of this argument is that executing a person is not ethical for the convict, the convict's family, and the family of the victim. Now, firstly, for the convict, unfair for the convict. Now, the characterization of execution is that it's the final and ultimate punishment that people cannot get out of because it's permanent death, right? So once a person is executed, there's no undoing that execution. Now, this is important because wrongful execution might occur for 3 reasons. Firstly, there might be a discrimination in court, i.e. the views of the minority. For example, you might think that all Mexicans are all drug dealers, right? So even if the jury is tested to not be biased, they still may have unconscious biases, which means that there still might be discrimination in court. The second reason is that your status in society, i.e. how much money you make, will affect your court in general, because the quality of your defense rests on your financial capability. And thirdly, there are human errors in society that we have to take account. And there are so much more reasons why. So this is so prevalent that since 1973 in the US, almost 150 people have been wrongfully executed. This is just America. Think of how much innocent people have been murdered by the state. Even now, 4.1% of the death row inmates are suspected to be innocent. Now, with that in mind, we believe that even a small chance at executing the innocent is still a very big impact because it's human lives you're talking about. This is an irreversible impact. On our side, we protect these people by allowing them to have appeals and a longer amount of time to go back to court and prove their innocence. Now, the second reason why it's principally wrong is because it's unfair for the family. It is unfair for the family to have their relatives be executed in the first place. There are 2 reasons to support this claim. Firstly, they might be innocent. In that case, how are we going to compensate for their loss? How will we say to that the state murdered this innocent person? I challenge the opposition to say that that an apology will suffice, a bit of money will suffice, because it is morally unacceptable but to put the family members through this type of agony only to learn that they died for nothing. The second reason is that even if the convict isn't innocent, the convict's families are. When we sentence the people to death and execute them, we are putting the convict's family on an emotional roller coaster. Judge, imagine your sister or brother, your mother or father being killed right in front of your eyes. Imagine what it feels like to have your loved ones being sentenced to absolute death. At this point, we believe that the moral turmoil for a family outweighs any kind of retribution that the death penalty brings because it does the same harm when the convict murdered the victim. Now, the third reason why our side is superior is because it caters to the family of the victims. To be clear, the victim that we're talking about is the convict's victims, i.e. the people that they murdered, right? Now, the characterization of the death penalty is that it's a very harsh sentence. So when people get it, they often want to appeal. They want to consult a different judge and jury. That is why it takes such a long time to actually have the death penalty carried out. So why is it so important? Well, firstly, every time a trial occurs, the family members are asked to testify and confront the murderer. This is morally wrong because even if you want revenge, the weight of your son's murder or your mother's murder comes back every single time when you testify in front of everyone, talking about talking about their lives, talking about how they murdered that individual. But secondly, even if it's a quick trial, it still reminds these individuals of their murdered relatives. And at this point, you're simply punishing the family of the victim by putting them under constant reminder that Ben was killed by Pat or Ella was killed by Gabby. We should not punish the family of the victims since it's simply morally wrong. In this debate, opening government stance is very clear. We oppose the death penalty, but we support rehabilitation. By for example, allowing victims to actually rehabilitate to get released from prison. In our claim, we told you that death penalty is illegitimate for all the members. So why should state necessarily ban them? Because the existence of death penalty literally sends a systematic message that we're okay with those principal wrongs happening, and we're allocating the resources to the death penalty, which the only benefit you get is deterrence. Now, The second point I want to explain today is why deterrence doesn't actually happen in the death penalty. There are two mechanisms as to how crime happened and why death penalty is likely not to deter anything. And my second speaker will elaborate on the second mechanism. The first mechanism is that most crimes are out of rage and not very rational. Judge, imagine you have a big rage with someone and you think that murdering them and stabbing them is somewhat justifiable. At this point, it's highly unlikely that this concept of the death penalty would matter in that first place because you're irrational and all you want is to do is get that rage out by physically lashing out against your target. For all these reasons, we're so proud to propose.
Thank you. I thank the Prime Minister for the remark. Now I would like to welcome the leader of opposition. Please deliver the speech within 5 minutes. Here. ポイは30秒経ったら OK です。なんで your protected time is first 30 seconds and last 30 seconds.
Sorry. I am the leader of opposition, I think, of side opening opposition, and my time starts now. Proposition forgot that the status quo does not make so many mistakes as they characterize. The reality is most convicts who are given death penalties are people who are clearly convicts. These people who have committed mass murders, terrorisms, and mass arsonists. These are the people that are convicted. And the people they talk about are people of very, very low scope, and their impacts cannot really outweigh the majority of the cases. What am I going to be doing in my speech today? I'm going to be giving you a couple of rebuttals, engaging with all with their constructive points. And then I'm going to be moving on to a principal justification and then talking about how our side is indeed actually capable of deterring these criminals from committing crimes that are equivalent to death penalties. So firstly, a couple of rebuttals. So for their principal justification, they divided their point into two stakeholders, the convict and the people around them. And then they gave us three reasons why, there's not something very, it's not justified. They talked about discrimination, but we already tell you that there's things like jury systems to prevent this. It's not just one judge deciding who gets the death penalty. There's going to be people, more than one people, multiple people, multiple backgrounds, no thank you, who are going to be judging these people. And secondly, we also told you, we also think that human errors are just simply insane to be including as a part of reason, because there simply was no mechanism. Furthermore, just one line coming from proposition. But secondly, we think that the people go through literally years of studying in universities and high schools, and then they take a really, really difficult test to become lawyers and people who are capable of making these decisions. We simply say that there is no possibility that these people are going to be making human errors that are going to be so big that people want to convict them for. But secondly, but even if these errors do actually happen, we think that these people are going to be, these convicts have made some sort of errors, have committed crimes that is quite, similarly equivalent or somewhat equivalent to what happened to a death penalty. We say that in that case, even if there wasn't a death sentence, these people will be given a life sentence or something similar to a death penalty. So we think that either cases, we think, so moving on to their point about how it, to their second point about how the deterrence theory doesn't really work. And their entire premise of their argument lied on how people are going to be irrational. Note how this is not a just reason for a proposition to bring this into a debate, because even if when these people are irrational, that is their fault. For being irrational is not a fault that is not a thing that they can get away with for committing a crime. We think that is not a reason that proposition can bring up. But moving on to a principal justification of why we think we are just as
why?
No, thank you. So firstly, we think three reasons why we say this. Yes.
Don't you think that many of the criminals tend to have traumatic past or structural barriers that lead them to committing these types of crimes? Don't you think that it's unfair for you to completely blame it on that person?
Yes, but I already told you that there's going to be other systems like the jury system, which will be able to lay out and depict we'll be able to there's going to be other systems that will be able to take these things into consideration and find out what indeed is solely responsible, what they're indeed solely responsible for. But three reasons why we justify this. Firstly, we told you that there's going to be, Firstly, we think that two reasons. Firstly, the unique role of government. The unique role of government is that they have to have control over their citizens. That is the reason why, even if normal civilians aren't allowed to kill each other just because somebody killed their family members, we think that governments need to have a control over their citizens. And we think that having a death penalty, even if they don't use it, is going to be something that they need in order to control the lowest ranks of criminals. But secondly, we think that there's going to be a very, very low chance, in fact, zero chance of rehabilitation, because the majority of the people who are going to be criminalized for death penalties are usually people who are psychopaths or people who quite literally cannot be retributed. And we think that this is proven in the fact that most of these people come back to jail once or twice or three times, even after they're released from jail. We think that these people really have no chance of coming back to society as just normal people. But second point about deterrence, we think that there's going to be three reasons why our deterrence theory is going to actually stand. Firstly, there's going to be the simple reason, the simple fact that people fear death. There is no way that somebody would not fear death. Even if they're irrational, they'll know that they won't want to die, and they'll act upon that fact. If there's a death penalty, if there isn't a death penalty, these people will probably not acknowledge this. But secondly, we tell you that there's going to be this mutual understanding, something like a camaraderie, where people will be teaching each other, especially in impoverished countries, because for example, in Brazil, these families might be telling each other, try to avoid anything, but try to do anything but things that infringe or might fall under the death penalty. These are things that'll be disappearing, and there'll be less awareness of committing crimes and of committing such hideous crimes. But thirdly, we think that it contradicts with religious ideas. For example, the Quran, it asks for in sexual assault, like they try to penalize people with death for sexual assault. But when we take away the idea, when government tries to take away death penalty, we think that this contradicts with the fundamental ideas of religious ideologies. For these reasons, so proud to post.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. In this debate, opening government stance is very clear. We oppose death penalty, but we support rehabilitation by, for example, allowing for victims who actually rehabilitated from life sentence to get released from the prison, and etc. In our first claim, we told you that death penalty is illegitimate for all the members that it's involved in the death penalty. So why should state necessarily ban them? Because the existence of death penalty literally sends a systematic message that we're okay with those principal wrongs happening, and that we're allocating the resources to death penalty, which the only benefit you get is deterrence, which I'm going to show you can happen on both sides of the house. Now, I want to quickly bash out their point about legitimacy, because they came up here and tried to offer this argument that because the Quran states that reciprocity should be considered, you should automatically kill someone once they have killed another member in the society. We think that this is just simply wrong, because first of all, there's so many factors that play into one's murder that cannot just be reciprocated with being murdered, right? We think that there's so many factors, and I'm going to tell you what those factors are in my second question that I'll answer. But so therefore, I'll be asking two questions in my speech. First of all, in terms of principle, why this one chance of mistrial is unjustifiable? And secondly, why death penalty doesn't do anything to actually deter crimes? So first of all, principle, why this one chance of mistrial is unjustifiable. So opening opposition talked about how there's a lot of people that comes in forms of trials, right? And at the end of the day, they're still humans, but we think that at the end of the day, they're still humans. And that's why 4.4% of the convicts in death row is probably innocent, right? There's a lot of things that play out in the judges' minds, for example, race or the backgrounds that these people come from. And therefore, we think that these kind of miscommunication can happen, and thus missentencing might happen. Okay, but let's just concede that these are some minor cases, right? But even if it is some minor cases, human life is the most important delta in any debate, right? The difference between life sentence and death penalty is that death penalty is irreversible. On our side, if the convict shows remorse and have been rehabilitated, we're more than happy to release them. Opposition says that these convicts of death penalty will have no chance of recovery, but no, I'm going to explain in my second point about why there are so many factors in a murder and thus they're likely to recover. So moving on to your second question, why death penalty doesn't do anything to actually deter crimes. So my first already told you why murder is irrational and thus you can't stop it on both sides, but moving on to the second mechanism as to why death penalty doesn't do anything to actually deter crimes. Second mechanism. So most murders are somewhat to be blamed for bad infrastructure / bad education or those state failures, as my closing government POI'd, right? people from poor regions are more susceptible to being criminalized and therefore sent to death penalty. And that is because the infrastructure is so bad that, for example, in the slums of Philippines, murder is something that is always happening around you, or that you didn't receive anything to get jobs, and therefore you had to turn into the world of gangs and drug abuse. Therefore, in vast majority of cases, murders and crimes are stemmed from those state failures, and this adds to a principal layer about why it's unfair to the victims, because the state is to be blamed for creating an environment where those crimes seem to be justifiable. Therefore, we think that the main argument for why opposition wants to keep the death penalty will be regarding how death penalty deters crimes, but we already told you why in vast majority of cases, it doesn't directly deter crimes, as it doesn't directly cut down the mechanisms as to how crimes happen. Comparatively, on our side, we will allocate money we get from death penalty to allocate this to policies regarding the similar criminal.
Point of information.
Look, about $1.26 million are used in every single instance of death penalties through lawsuits and occupations and actually carrying out that act. Therefore, we think that the government will likely use this money within the same realms of criminal justice. For example, trying to better the infrastructure within poor regions or making education better for inmates so that they don't go out into the public and do things like this. I'll take your POI.
Don't you think that the money that you're going to have to take from these executions is going to have to be used so you can actually keep these criminals that you are no longer killing into these prisons? Prisons cost far more money because these people are going to be in these prisons for around 50 or more years. That means that you're going to have to allocate for their food, for their
we think that death penalty is a very minor case, and thus the state is probably able to get lands to account for these people. But even if this financial allocation does not happen and we end up using all the money we save from from death penalty into actually housing these people, at least we are giving more chances for recovery for the poor people in slums who are somewhat pushed by state failures into committing these crimes, or at least we give more chances for these innocent people that were mistrialed into being released into the public so that they can get justice for themselves, right? We see that those things are the most important delta that we propose. Opposition needs to engage with this. We're so proud to propose.
お願いします。DM。はい。
I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Sure, it is unjustifiable for the state to abolish the death penalty just because of the risk. There's a risk of mistakes, which is unlikely to occur. My dear leader of the opposition that they told you. So, full argument mainly coming from the proposition or opening government. So, number one, there is a risk of execution and mistakes for the jurisdictional system. So, mainly 3 responses. Firstly, they have brought up the example of unconscious bias, that like the relativity of Black people under committing certain crimes, right? So against this, I have one refutation. Like we think we admit that there are a certain extent, like there is a solid unconscious bias against this certain group of the minority, but there is a solid correlation between the likelihood of committing crimes and the racial minorities or the group that they belong to, right? So, and it is like we can mitigate this principle because we say that about this penalty is just a minor case, and we also say that there's a solid correlation between likelihood and the people's identity, people's group, the group that they belong. So it is so it can be mitigated. No, thank you. So second thing to say is that it is leader of the opposition tells you there is multiple people to judge and it is unlikely to occur. And third thing to say is that they are only talking about a worst case scenario. The first accusation will occur, right? So, but on our side of the house, we will clearly show you that this the best case scenario. The best case scenario on our side of the house should be priorities because we can we can prosecute these serious killers, and which should be prioritized because number one, we can this can act as a deterrent, and second thing is that we can relieve the psychological burden of victims. So second thing that they're talking about is workability of deterrence. So No, thank you. So they brought up two mechanisms. Firstly, these crimes caused by the outrage, right? So one response to this is the vast majority of serious crimes, such as serious killings, is caused not by the outrage, but the well-plotted strategies. But because they have this so harmful anti-societal sentiment, that just because they have so excluded from the society, they have kind of anti-societal sentiment and they committed crime. So it is unlikely to occur because
Why?
no, thank you. It is unlikely to occur. Second thing that talking so about the deterrence, we already told you that all people have the a sense of sense to want to avoid fear, and therefore this deterrence certainly occur. And third thing that they are talking about the principal argumentation that executing the criminals by introducing death penalty is unjustifiable because it is sending out the signals that killing is justifiable. But it is not true. We think that any civilians are not allowed to kill others on both sides of the house, right?
Why?
So it is unjustified. It is no, thank you. It is very nonsense to it is not allowing the civilians to kill others. We say the state is the only actor to prosecute and have the potential to prosecute these serious serious criminals. So
Why?
I think it is unjust. It is nonsense. Okay.
So in the case where the state is legitimized to kill people, literally murder 150 people since 1973, then aren't you sending out the message that the most important infrastructure in society right now, i.e. the state, is liable and justified to murder individuals for no particular reason?
Okay, three responses to this. Number one, we will clearly shows that there's a correlation between the minority and the likelihood of committing crime. And second thing is that you might think it is very moral thing, but it is just because it is feels like a moral. It is the proof that this death penalty is act as a deterrence, right? So many people fear this death penalty because they statistics shows that many people will be executed by the death penalty, right? The third thing to say is also the fourth argument coming from the opposite government, like financial allocation. We say, and they mistook the fact that rehabilitation costs more money than prosecuting death penalty, right? So I think it is more nonsense to allocate these costs to the psychopaths to rehabilitate. We think it is more reasonable to punish individuals who kill thousands of people. Therefore, we're so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Before my extensions to rebuttals, ladies and gentlemen, the whole of opposition's case is just not as significant. Opening talked on and on about mistakes. We want to go deeper than that. Firstly, what is the role of the government? OL tells you that it's the state's role to deter crimes. Two responses here. Firstly, this only mitigates the very extreme cases because as they characterize, death penalty is only a very few crimes. So their entire premise is false when they say that they'll deter crimes that fall under the death penalty that literally does not actually deter the entire crime rate because violent and non-violent crimes are still bound to happen. Second, FBI Unified Crime reports that states with death penalty have homicide rates 40 to 101% higher than states without the death penalty. So I think that this whole entire premise is just false. Secondly, do these criminals deserve to die, and whose fault is it? OO characterizes that everyone that commits a crime is just antisocial and puts the responsibility on them. We disagree with this premise. It's the structural barriers and the trauma that many minorities experience that push them into these crimes. It's the psychological disorders that the state was unable to treat. This is all partially fault of the state. Thus, why we think they need to take responsibility and need to give reparations, not just killing them off and pretending that they are doing something good. Now, one fricked preamp. Opposition might come up here and tell you all about how they can get cheaper prices. We don't really care about the price when it's got to do with human life, which is literally irreversible. I think that human life, which side can save more lives, is ultimately the clash in this debate that we need to look at. Now let's move on to the extension. We are the first side that's going to talk to you about the most important issue we see in this debate. Which side is ultimately going to decrease crime? This impacts the most people and why it outweighs the victims' families and convicts' families our opening talks about. Firstly, we think that This means more crime. My assertion is that death penalty de-incentivizes change, which leads to increased death and crime in the overall society. 3 layers of mechanization. Firstly, is that they lose the incentive to get a shorter sentence or appeal to the judge. Like, if you were going to die anyways, why would you want to do good things inside jail? Why would you want to not commit more crimes inside jail? The incentive just highly decreases on their side of the house. Second is that violence breeds violence. We don't think people who kill other people, so to show everyone how much we don't like people who kill people, are going to kill people who kill other people. We think that the fact that this is such like an ironic statement just pushes a very strong narrative that I think your opening also slightly talks about, especially when the status quo, many death penalties are broadcasted. We think that this has an especially big effect. Third is that people who commit death penalties themselves tend to have a lot of trauma because of this type of thing, knowing that they are killing people's lives, right? And knowing that it is their fault that someone's life was taken away. And this increases their likelihood of them themselves committing a crime and also costs more money at the end of the day. So next, I'm going to talk about the 2 impacts that I see on their side of the house. Firstly is that it increases more jail on jail crime. This is one of the biggest issues that I think opening completely just fails to talk about. This is one of the biggest issues in the status quo, where these convicts who many times have unresolved trauma or anger are stuck in the same place of prison cells with little freedom or time to release their anger with no rehabilitation. Of course, the guards are there, but the actual reason why this is somewhat controlled is because in most jails, people that have death penalty sentences don't exist there, and these people want to get out faster by acting well. The rates of jail on jail crime in prisons, sure, I'll take your POI.
Given that the death penalty, the number of death penalty is low in the first place, how big of a problem is your case?
Sure, it may not be every single jail. It may not be the most things that happen in the most cases, right? But we think that the fact that these incentives did decrease in the first place is impactful enough to outweigh over any case you're going to bring. Because the fact that these people, who are literally also people, they're surrounded with other criminals who tend to usually not have as long of a sentence as them, are going to die in these hands because of this death penalty, we say is unjust. Second is that there's just going to be more crime overall. When you justify it, they say that there's a very high narrative shift there. Maybe this is why America, one of the only countries that still have death penalty, still have such a high rate of death, especially with their guns. We think that this narrative plays a huge role. Now to the true world analysis on our side of the house. This is where we give you the true world analysis opening didn't give you and the advantage that we see. We don't think it's similar. We don't think it's symmetric. We think it's even better. When we ban death penalty, the impact is that we have less crime overall on our side of the house. Let's look at Canada. Since abolishing the death penalty in 1976, Canada's murder rate has steadily declined, and as of 2016, it was the lowest since 1966. This is a direct evidence where we have less crime. I'll take a POI. 3,
Can you provide a structural mechanism as to why by abolishing death penalty, you're likely to decrease crimes?
Sure, I already give you the analysis here on this, but first of all, we tell you about how when you decrease death penalty, it increases your likelihood, it increases these prisoners' incentive to actually do good things in jail. It increases their incentive to do, for example, volunteer work, to example, be a very good person in jail so that they can get a shorter or lighter sentence. We've seen cases where people who got death penalties were able to show really great behavioral change in prisons and then were able to be taken out and are now active members of the society, right? We simply think that this incentive increases, and that's a big enough incentive, as we've seen in the past, for these people to get out of jail, become a better person, and work better overall. We think that this is the incentive push that we give to you here. So ultimately, at the end of the day, when we are the side that's able to have less crime overall, when we are the side that is able to impact the most people in the society, we have to take this debate. Thank you.
When the government side is trying to justify the fact that these people are going to be let off free just with jail time, we believe that they are not exactly understanding what kind of crimes these people have committed. These are the people who have raped countless people, who have killed because of their pleasure. These are the John Wayne Gacy's, the Ted Bundy, the terrorists, etc. We believe that these people have no chance of redemption, and thus they're justified to be killed not only for their own good, but also for the safety of society and for the justice that the government is promised to hand out. For these reasons, we believe that as a closing opposition, we are justified to take this case and why we as the whole debate should win. First of all, I would like to analyze a few of the things that both the opening government and the opening opposition have failed to characterize in their case. For that point, for the opening government about discrimination is called, they've still not exactly clarified how it's better on their side. They're talking about how mistrials are often can be prevented on their side, but there is an average of 260 more months between death penalty and the execution. That is more than 20 years. If there is any chance of these people being innocent, most of the cases come out during that time. Furthermore, they've given evidence of how there is 150 mistrials going on, no thank you, during the time of 1977 to around as of now. most of those 150 cases had happened before the 21st century, where a lot of the DNA evidence is still not sufficient. Our technology has become far better. It's far easier for people to actually evaluate whether that person is on the scene of the crime or not, whether that person is actually innocent or not. For these reasons, we believe that their discrimination course stance, as well as their mistrial stance, does not really stand. Second of all, talking to their deterrence case on how this does not happen because the people who do these crimes are irrational of mind. We believe that while the opening government tried to refute against this, they have not done a clear job, and thus I will do so in my speech. First of all, we believe this is not true. Like we have clearly said, these people who are committing these crimes have a proper conscience. We believe these people have it planned out. That is one of the main factors that comes when we are talking about a murder. You need to talk about the intent, how much they have planned, how much they have thought about killing that person. We believe all these factors are evaluated, as well as their mental health and their environmental impact. We believe that it's unlikely for the government, who strives on being fair, who strives on giving the best amount of results so that justice can be properly carried, will actually go out of their way to make sure that this does not, that these people are not being properly
Point of information.
no thank you, are being properly punished. Now let's go into things that the opening opposition have lacked. They have lacked in their response to the government, many of which I've given right now, and their point on deterrence and the points of deterrence have also been very lacking. Now let's go into my refutations on what the closing government has said on the jail and jail cries. We believe that jail and jail cries still happen on either side. Even if these people do have some sort of incentive, a lot of these people still go bored. These are people who have aggressiveness on their mind. These are people who have been in gangs for years. They're still going to try and cause trouble. They're still going to have some sort of sense of danger. And because of that, there are still many crimes that are going on in jail with or without this kind of death penalty. Now going to the point that we as the extension would like to give on actually proving why crimes will deter. We believe that crimes will deter because these people who are put in capital punishment are not doing it because they have no choice. These criminals are the ones that are being punished because they knew the severity of their actions and committed these crimes anyway. It means that with the death penalty put in place, these potential murderers will know that once they kill someone, they will have their own lives on the line. These criminals are not desperate and have the capacity of thinking on their own. They are not these kinds of vulnerable, weak members of society that the government have been trying to characterize. Thus, they will actually think before killing someone because they understand that once they end this person's life, theirs will end as well. We believe that many of these people who are actually being put on death penalty have been given very careful mental evaluation, environmental evaluation. They've been given trials over and over again to make sure that these people are actually guilty, are actually at the scene of the crime. No, thank you, are actually not innocent. And for these reasons, we believe that anything that the governments that have given on this point does not stand. Now let's talk about the justice for victims, why the trade-off of the lives of victims is actually allowed. We believe that as the government side, it is important for us to be it's important for us to make sure that justice is properly carried out. That is one of the main fundamental goals of the government. Once these people are not given proper justice. Sorry, what?
PY.
No, thank you, because I'm up to 30 seconds. So we believe that it's important for the government to give out these proper handouts of justice, because once they do not do that, then the people stop caring about what the government has to say. The government is important. The government has power because they have the power to give these people these kinds of punishments. Once we are not able to do that, these people stop listening. These kinds of crimes will go on forever. Because of these reasons, not only are we justified to do this, but we should be enforcing this in our daily lives. For these reasons, we believe that as a closing opposition, we should not be abolishing the death penalty. Thank you.
My speech will be giving you a speech in bench by bench analysis style. Most of the rebuttals and weighing will be integrated. So starting with the CEO that we directly clash with, they have two arguments in total. First, these people don't for redemption, right? How do we say that no one is born a criminal, right? It is the structural issues that the state is responsible for, and it is many times not their fault for like killing someone, because like for example, they live in poverty, for example, they have no good education, for example, they're born with like mental disabilities, right? Second, there have been cases where people were able to get out of jail and become active members in the society, as my partner has given you. This just proves that people will be able to redempt with a chance given to them. Third, we should give people a chance no matter what, right? Because everybody deserves a second chance, in a sense where like people should be able to reflect upon their past wrongdoings. And even more, the state should not be the ones fundamentally killing people just because the others has killing someone, right? This is not a principle. This is a principle argument that talks about how like the state ultimately has no responsibility in killing them, and this system is really outdated. Now, second argument, jail on jail crime still happens. They said it is because they're bored, right? However, we say their weak incentive analysis here don't outweigh the fact that they want to get out of jail. Even if it's true, we still allow people with less violent crimes in these jails to live safer and decrease crime rates in the society. Now, moving on to the OO. Their only argument is unique role of the government and how it will deter crime. They have talked about why First, why government has a unique role of making their citizens safe, and second, how their lifestyle will be able to deter against the crimes that fall under the conviction of the death penalty. The open government has responded with how they do not actually combat against the root of the crime, and their second argument directly clashes against this. Why we as closing government were able to win over the opening clash and explaining why deterrence in crime is just not true. About the clash, OG argues for the root problem of the crime, OO argues for the fear factors that deters people away. What CG gives you in this house is that we give you full statistics on how it is not true. Even if it's not about anger and rage issues, we still tell you that this is a factually untrue claim because we actually see no deterrent, right? Second, we tell you that it even increases crime because jail on jail crime, and this incentivizes a change that can be condemned by the criminals. By having jail time, we were able to lock criminals in jail, and some see this as a kind of torture. Which side will be able to deter crime more, right? By locking people up in jail for a long time, letting them condemn their life over their mistake and wrongdoing, or do you think it is able, no thank you, to deter crime by killing people and letting them go easy way by sending themselves to heaven, right? Or hell. This is also why many victims opposes death penalty. We also tell you that we offer a time for them to change because many who are fully accessed as capable to be back in the society are actually able to go back to the society good and they were able to redeem, right? This goes both sides and directly answers the question that CEO is saying how we are not seeing the framework clearly and saying we're ignoring the fact that some people can never go out. We could go both ways, right? To the people who can go out and for the people who cannot. Now this clash point is fully explained, and let's talk about the last remaining house, the OG. Because I have talked about their second argument, failure of deterrence has successfully taken it down, I'll be talking about their first argument, the principal argument. They approach this argument in many layers, and let me talk about each of them. First, once someone gets a sentencing, right, they do not get out because of corrupted systems such as wrongful sentencing and the gap between rich and poor, as well as discrimination. Second, it is unfair for the family because they might be innocent. Third, unfair for the victims because they have to constantly justify, right? However, this is how we respond to each. About the first and the second point, they have relied their entire premise upon wrongful sentencing and convictions, while we as a closing government believe in the logic. There is just a lack of mechanization upon each structural barrier, right? Sure, some people might be innocent, but why is this wrong, especially for the death penalty, and why is this extremely harmful for the poor people and the vulnerables, right? Judge, it is totally unfair for side government to abolish death penalty because some people might be innocent, quote from the DLO, right? This is where we as a closing government comes in because we explain and provide you with the full mechanization. We tell you that with poor people, it is less likely for them to be able to get a good lawyer and have to rely on public defendant, which is a long process and corrupted system in which, one, they're not as good, or second, some people actually fall under the death penalty in waiting line. This means that their side actually carries out less justice and cannot give a chance to people who to be able to defend themselves, right? Fundamentally, this is not what the justice system is about, right? At the end of the day, even if there is 10 to 20 years before they get killed, if they get sentenced to death penalty once, it is almost impossible to change it. It is a lot harder to change it compared to jail sentence, where we have a higher likelihood of giving people the second chance and letting them condemn. For the above, we are able to take down all, and we have won this debate as CG proud to propose.
Second chances are too risky. We need to think about the betterment of the whole society, not just about the criminals that have, first of all, committed atrocious crimes that killed or hurt many people. And so we're so proud to oppose this motion. So I'd first like to compare between CG and CO, which directly clashed, right? So first, closing government talked about how they focus on the fact that there's going to be less crimes in jail. We think that we've told you why this is not important, right? This is a minor problem because death penalty does not happen, first of all. So we don't see why their point has to overweigh the deterrence of crimes in general, right? But secondly, we think that we told you no, thank you, how these like jail crimes are still going to happen on their side of the house, right? Why? Because these people in jails are in gangs. We think that because one person who has the incentive to hurt other people, for example, in a terrorist attack, one person can kill 1,000 people, right? We think that we need to deter these crimes from happening, and we think that because CG failed to prove how crimes in jail are so important, we think that they fail over our side. Now, no, thank you. Now, about the false accusations, we think that OO and OG talked about how false accusations, whether they'll occur or not. However, we think that though opening opposition talked about the jury system, we think that this was insufficient. And our closing opposition told you sufficient details about why the false accusations are not going to happen, because in the status quo, the quality of the investigations are high. On top of that, we think that there's enough social media attention and there's a movement for equality, right? We think that there's louder voices for minorities that are going to be heard, and that's exactly why the state will be exposed. It's more likely that they're going to be hurt, to be attacked if they have like false accusations. But secondly, we think that the burden for judges is big, right? The burden to say that someone is going to die is really big. So we think that this in itself is enough to deter enough crimes and stop false accusations from happening. This is exactly why we think that the opening government fails, because their main point is about how it's unfair for innocent victims, right? However, we think that because the quality of the investigations is high enough, we think that their case is very unlikely to happen. Yes, I'll take your POI.
So even if we do take your case that the quality of investigation is better on your side of the house, it still doesn't justify the 150 murders by the state that happens in your worst case, and that is probably the most holistic view of events. So how can you rebut the instance where human lives are at stake and which is the most important delta in today's debate?
Okay, first of all, we think that we've told you how the status quo is changing, the quality is rising, and because your data is from like 1973, right? We think that the situation is high. But secondly, and more importantly, the death of victims is also irreversible. We think that your model is about how criminals can walk out, right? We think this means that the victims' families are going to be scared for death because someone who has killed your family member is walking outside, they're working normally, right? We think that this is very scary, and compared with the 4% or the 150 people you talked about, we think that we need to protect the victims who were, for example, just walking outside and their family member was killed, right? We think the trade-off is clear. We need to think about the victims' families, because these people, these criminals, when they walk out, because they've committed atrocious crimes in the past, we think that it is very unlikely that they're going to be fully rehabilitated, right? If they have another event that comes up, we think that they're going to start, for example, wanting to kill other people because there are structural barriers or because there's psychological problems within them, right? We need to consider these victims over these people. Now, talking lastly about the deterrence of crimes, which is our main point. We think that opening opposition talked about how like people fear death in general, but we told you about how these we've told you on top of that how like people committing these crimes have a proper conscience, right? This is a unique thing that we've told you from closing opposition, in that these people have had multiple chances to think about their actions, but have chosen to rape more people, to kill more people. And that's why they ended up in the environment of people, especially because people in general have a fear of death. This is exactly why we think that the deterrence of crime will happen only when death penalty is always an option that the state can put. Because the state is the only actor that has enough capital to put people on death penalty, we think that we've taken this debate. Thank you.
Okay, I thank opposition whip. Now all speech is over. Thank you for your cooperation. Adjudication time.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is May Kurata. I was the chair judge for today's debate. We came to a decision, unanimous, I think. So first place we gave to opening government. second place to closing government, third place to opening opposition, and fourth to closing opposition. So basically, this is a government bench win. And the reason are as follows. We thought the two main issues of today's debate, first of all, was about the wrongfully convicted people who may be sentenced to death and why life imprisonment is a better ultimatum for them. And secondly, about the deterrence power of death penalties. Both, I think, issues included both practical elements and principle elements. So instead of dividing it into those two kind of frameworks, I will just talk about the two issues and how it was debated. So we hear both of these issues right from the beginning from the opening government team. And the reason why overall the government team, the government bench won this debate was because we thought on both of these issues, they were able to overcome some of the questions that were thrown at them from the opposition team. Now, today's opposition team in general, we felt both teams had pretty negative cases, and we would have liked to hear more about how you would defend death penalty in a more positive, well, death penalty is a very grim topic, but in a more constructive way. So let's say, like, why is it necessary for the state to control citizens? Why is the death penalty necessary to deter the worst crimes from happening in society? And why should that always be prioritized in any kind of situations? Those types of constructive matter that actively defend the death penalty, we thought in general were lacking from the opposition team. So that's why it kind of came down to the first two issues that I mentioned and how the government team in general defended that against all the questions that were provided from the opposition teams. Now, so let's talk about why we thought that the opening team contributed a little more than the closing team for the government team. So we thought that the OG gave most of the constructive matter for both of those issues in a pretty concise manner. And it was very clear from the beginning that there were certain issues regarding wrongful convictions, and there were certain issues regarding how some criminals, even if they do commit a crime, it might be because of the environment. And finally, about how deterrence power works. And so most of the issues that came from the closing government team was about the jail to jail crime and how life imprisonment can, increase or decrease committing crimes again and make sure that people have good incentives for better, lives and being able to get out of prison. The reason why we thought that that part of the constructive matter didn't contribute enough to the win was because it still rested on the fact that these people who have committed the crimes are still being punished for what they did. So the environmental factor that the government team started talking about, the importance of, rehabilitation and the importance of making sure that the mistakes that the state has done to these people are being righted, rested still on the opening government team's contributions, talking about why there are environmental factors that the government needs to face. And secondly, about the other two issues about deterrence and wrongfully convicted people, I didn't think that there was enough new material coming to completely overtake the contributions made by the opening government team. However, we thought that the closing government team still did better than the opposition teams. First of all, because this is a long cross, I guess, between so I'm comparing now the second and third team, which is closing government and opening opposition. So we thought that the closing government still did better than the opening opposition, firstly because of the contributions on the wrongfully convicted victims. So the opening opposition did quite a good job at talking about how there are enough mechanisms in place to prevent wrongful convictions, and that these are the minor cases of minor cases of minor cases, basically these really heinous crimes being blamed on people who happen to be at a place at the wrong time. Anyways, so in terms of, I guess, the number of these cases happening and the actual physical impacts of the lives being destroyed by these cases, I think the opening opposition did a pretty good job, even at the opening stage, of really reducing and making sure that it's a realistic picture of what really happens, that it's a really rare number of cases. So the only way really for the government team to be able to win against such arguments was to say that even if it's a really minor number of cases, why it's really important to prevent such things from happening and to make sure that there are chances for these people to be able to get out of prison, to be able to prove their innocence. And although the opening government team did talk about how, like, they did start by saying that, the whole framing was that even one case of this happening is something that is heinous and something that needs to be prevented. But I think the reasoning really came, the importance came from the closing government team. So that's why we thought that the closing government team won over that on that issue. Regarding deterrence, I think a lot of the mechanisms about the jail to jail crime, if we were able to take that more seriously and more heavily than we mentioned, I think that still is somewhat enough to balance out between the differences of opening opposition and closing government. So it's a slight difference, but I think overall the closing government team did a good enough job of defending the closing bench's issues. So finally, comparing the opening opposition team and the closing opposition team. So the reason why closing opposition came last was because we felt that many of the constructive arguments that were provided didn't seem like constructive arguments. And the reason why that was the case was because, one, I think a lot of it was framed as refutations, and secondly, it wasn't extended enough by the whip speaker to say that it's an extension, to say that it's a new contribution to the debate and why it matters and why that is making sure the the opposition team is winning. And we're not saying that, we're not like completely discrediting reputations. I think there were some marvelous ones. I really like the ones about the DNA, because that is an exact refutation against the statistics that were provided by the opening government team. And I really like the fact that the closing opposition team expanded the scope of the debate to say how society works and how the society is impacted when the state loses the death penalty as a means to control the behaviors of people in general. I think the way that those arguments, I think I see great potential for those lines of framing, lines of cases. And I think the only thing that was lacking was appropriate contents, appropriate arguments, reasonings that would have supported, and also for the both speakers of the team to consistently defend those two things as something new and something that is contributing to the opposition bench win. So when we compare the opening opposition team and the closing opposition team, the clear difference is that the opening opposition team provides a clear enough case, although seems a little negative opposition type, kind of, not very constructively defending death penalty. It's still a clear enough case against the government teams. And both speakers were consistently defending the same lines. And at the end of the day, when we compare the closing teams with the opening teams, I think the closing teams always have the responsibility to tell us why their contributions are new and why it's not the same as the opening opposition teams, and why they somehow are able to overtake them. So that's our verdict. ちょっと長かったかな。はい。10分くらい話しちゃいましたね。
Do you have any questions about the call and adjudication?
Yes, if anybody has questions.
毎週月曜日夜20時から高校生向けに英語ディベートをオンラインで練習しています。興味がある人はぜひ連絡してみてください。Let's join High School Debate Bootcamp!